MMA reporter for Sportsnet in Canada, our good friend Aaron Bronsteter. AB, UFC 297 beckons. Congratulations on the new gig. Great to have you back on the show. It's been a while.
It's great to be back. And you know what else is great, John? This 2-camera setup you got going on. I mean, this is some pretty professional stuff. Whoever set this up, I got to say. I mean, Kenny, I'm not trying to slag you. You only need one camera for you. I mean, John's bringing another Anik into the fold. It's like Anik Square and Florian, but this camera setup is...
He's not messing around, dude. He's not messing around.
Well, thank you, buddy. And you look crystal clear. And just so you know, we got 3 fucking cameras.
Right? Your biggest fan right here.
3 cameras. Look at that.
I'm regular for you. Just letting you know. All right, so your career began as an intern 18 years ago with Sportsnet, the Fan 590, and now you're back there in a full-time capacity. So got to be pretty exciting for you, not just to return to these airwaves, of course, but to have your career sort of, I know you're still a young man, but come full circle now 18 years later to be under that Sportsnet banner.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. And I mean, interestingly enough, we've got UFC 297 in Toronto, like 3 weeks into my job here. I mean, they're throwing me right into the fire here, but I love it. And I've got to say the team at Sportsnet have just been absolutely crushing it. I'm so happy to have such a great support system around me. Everybody's been so welcoming. So it's really, honestly, been awesome.
All right, we will get to some fight-related stuff shortly, but I have always said, and you've heard me say this, per capita, I think mixed martial arts fans in Canada make more noise than anywhere else in the world. Now, you can argue for the Aussies, the Brazilians, certainly anybody in the UK, but when I was cutting my teeth journalistically in the MMA world at ESPN and Kenny and I were covering like UFC 113, that was like as deafening an environment in Montreal as I had ever been in. And Georges St-Pierre wasn't even competing. So first time back in Toronto in a long time. How do you sort of quantify your enthusiasm for this live event on pay-per-view coming up in a few days?
Well, weather aside, which I think a lot of the UFC fighters are in for a rude awakening when they land here in the YYZ, I think that it's going to be awesome. I mean, I was thinking about this earlier, John, and you can probably vouch for this. Like, that card in Vancouver was a special card in terms of the live element of it. Like, being there in that building, it really did feel like a special night. It was the first time the UFC had been back in Canada. Did it translate for you sitting cage side as something that felt bigger than other pay-per-views?
There's no doubt about it. It definitely felt enormous, and certainly I think the Canadian success on that night had a lot to do with it. But yeah, no, it felt huge. It felt long overdue, and I think this one feels even more so because as much as Mike Malott enjoyed making that walk in Vancouver, this is an entirely different initiative essentially in his backyard.
Yeah, for sure. These guys have dreamt of fighting in this building. Himself, Jasmine Jasdavicius, I'm sure Siri City, who's making his UFC debut, probably feels that same way. And you know, the Canadians had a lot of success in Vancouver. There were 6 of them. Now we've got 9 of the first 10 fights at UFC 297 has a Canadian. So, you know, it's going to be a lot of pressure for, I think, these athletes to try to replicate that same success.
Well, before I lay out for the professional athlete, Kenny Florian, I just want to get your thoughts on this. There have been some complaints about the level of this fight card, especially relative to the depth on some of the surrounding pay-per-views, UFC 299, UFC 300. Got anything for us on that in terms of the pulse in the North and these fans about UFC 297 specifically?
Well, I think there's a hunger for people to come back and see the live experience. So I don't think the card is quite as stacked. I mean, you look at 299, compare it to this, it's comparing apples to oranges. And I even went back and looked at the UFC Fight Night card in Calgary that was on Dana White's 50th birthday back in the day. And on that card, it was Poirier Alvarez 2. Joanna Jędrzejczyk was on the card. Jose Aldo was on the card. A young Islam Makhachev was in the card. So Khabib was in the building. It was a really stacked fight night card. And now we've got this card. We've had some fights fall off, unfortunately, that never got replaced. I think that's what the biggest complaint is right now that I'm hearing from the Canadian fans is you lose, you know, Rakic versus Blachowicz. You lose Alberg versus Reyes. And they didn't, you know, add anything new to the card. So I think that's something of a complaint that I've been hearing from those that bought tickets for this event.
Aaron, you know, certainly since the retirement of Georges St-Pierre, we've seen less cards in Canada. And whether that's because of just the international expansion in general of the UFC and how much it's grown, or maybe it's because we don't have that huge star like a Georges St-Pierre in Canada, or, you know, people, you know, some of the fighters complain about the taxes or whatever. What do you think the reason is for that? And is there a guy either on the card or off the card that you think can break through as that next, you know, potential star on that Georges St-Pierre level?
Well, it's weird, Kenny, because I don't think it's by design. I think you look at the pandemic and it's slowing down really travel everywhere. You know, prior to the pandemic, it was a pretty consistent 1 pay-per-view, 3 fight nights, every single year in Canada. I don't think it's going to get back to that level. Even now, I think we're probably still going to see one pay-per-view, maybe 2 fight nights a year. And I think that's kind of a product of the Apex being used for cards more often for fight nights. I think that overall, there's just going to be less fight nights to go around. But I do think that you're right in terms of the star power. You look at Canada, and we haven't really seen a burgeoning star. I mean, Felicia Spencer fought for the title, but I think that's because that was like a 4-person division at 145 pounds. No disrespect to Felicia, but we haven't really seen any Canadians fight for titles lately. But we're starting to see a lot of them come on. We talk about that Vancouver card, them running the table, going 6-0. Lupi Godinez had she was the first female to have 4 UFC wins in a calendar year back in 2023. So I think her moving over to Entrom Gym in Mexico is going to give her, the chance to potentially compete for a championship at some point in time if she can keep up this sort of tear that she's on. But we've got Mike Malott, and the thing about Mike Malott is he's a welterweight, and with that comes the expectation because you have the torchbearers, not just in GSP, but Carlos Newton before him, GSP, then Rory McDonald that followed him. I mean, when you hear a Canadian welterweight, you have those big shoes to fill, and I don't think Mike Malott really gets weighed down by that pressure. I think that his mentality is strong enough to kind of allow him to be his own man. But I think that the Canadians are always going to look at the Canadian welterweights that are coming up and compare them to those guys. And those are lofty comparisons.
And what do you think, an impressive win, a dominant win over someone like Neil Magny does for Mike Malott in Canada?
Oh, it does a ton because it'll get him into the rankings at welterweight. And that's not an easy rankings to crack. If you look at the welterweight division, it's really stacked. But on top of that, I think when the UFC starts coming back to Canada for fight nights, that's where Mike Malott can start getting those big opportunities to headline fight nights against some of the higher ranked welterweights out there. I mean, even if he loses to Neil Magny, I still think you could make a case that he could headline some Canadian fight night cards as well. But I think that the chance of his meteoric rise continuing with a win over Neil Magny, that's almost a certainty. The guy's great on the mic, good looking guy, action fighter who likes to get finishes. I think that he's really the total package in that regard. But as you know, in MMA, you're only as good as your last win. And, a win over Neil Magny, I think, would do wonders for him.
Sportsnet's Aaron Bronsteter with us here on the Anik Florian podcast. On X, you can find him at Aaron Bronsteter. On Instagram, it is at A Bronsteter. And you sort of made the segue for me as I hearken back to the days of live events in Halifax and Saskatoon. A UFC fight night headlined by Mike Malott in the Great White North seems to be the requisite next step. Now, my colleague Dave Shaw is very tight-lipped with me, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot here, but given the UFC Apex reality that we all live in, however unfortunate, how confident are you that there would be a non-pay-per-view, a UFC fight night in Canada in 2024?
Well, I think we'll see 2 of them. I think we'll see one, if I had to guess, in Halifax, and I think the other one will be somewhere on the West Coast, likely Calgary or Edmonton. Again, these are educated guesses, I would call them, but I think that's kind of where we're going to see fight nights fall. I think they are starting to get into the back to the old school calendars where you are trying to check some boxes and say, okay, for Canada, we want 3 or 4 events a year. We want one in Ireland. We want one in France, one in Sweden.
Right.
Maybe. You look at the different countries and you try to allot the fight nights that you do have to those countries. But hey, I mean, the Apex is still seemingly going to be used for the foreseeable future. So I think a lot of the destinations that are craving the UFC, that's why we're seeing such high gates and attendance at a lot of these events, is because there's a real hunger for the UFC to come to those cities.
And other nations are experiencing this as well, right? I mean, Kenny and I have been to Brazil dozens of times. I think I've done 29 live UFC events in Brazil, everywhere from Jaraguá do Sul to Uberlândia and everywhere else, but it just isn't happening with the frequency that it was several years ago. So in terms of this main event, I mean, this is the good news, because for me, the jumping off point for all of these pay-per-views relative to my own internal excitement is the main event. This is the first UFC middleweight championship fight not featuring Israel Adesanya since George St. Pierre fought Michael Bisping in 2017. I know we're aligned here, AB. This fight, Sean Strickland, Dracus du Plessis, is of the highly anticipated variety, one of my more anticipated fights, championship or otherwise, in the entire first quarter, which is loaded. So where are you as far as your excitement for this main event coming up Saturday night?
Well, first off, that's a tremendous stat that I might borrow from you this week when I'm doing interviews. So I'll be sure to credit you when I do. But yeah, I'm very excited because I think that Dracus du Plessis is a guy that's been incredibly slept on for the last year or so. When people were making predictions about that Whittaker fight, I get a lot of them wrong, but that was one of the ones that I got right. I thought that Dracus was going to get the knockout against Robert Whittaker. So I'll pat myself on the back, a little Barry Horowitz style there. But I think that when you look at the middleweight division, I think that there's a lot of intrigue from what happens not just in this fight, but the fallout from this fight. And that's why I'm very curious to see what happens. We'll see if, Sean Strickland's win is going to be written off as being a flash in the pan or getting Israel on a bad night and Dracus walks through him. Or we're going to see if Sean Strickland is able to fight a guy that has not yet lost in the UFC in Dracus du Plessis and do what he does to all of the other opponents that he's beaten, pressure them, suffocate them, and put on that kind of pressure that has made a lot of his opponents wilt.
So perhaps we as a fan base shouldn't have been surprised that Sean Strickland had the crowd in Sydney, Australia against Israel Adesanya. Of course, Izzy beating their favorite son, Robert Whittaker, didn't necessarily help his public approval rating in a country that is not his home nation, but certainly a country in which he has had a lot of support. So any expectations as to who might have the crowd at Scotiabank Arena come Saturday night?
Well, I'm eager to see what happens at the press conference on Thursday, because if Sean Strickland comes in complaining about gun control and the weather, I think that maybe the Canadians will turn on him in a hurry. But at the same time, Canadians usually like to cheer for everybody when it comes to mixed martial arts. I've noticed you don't really have a lot of disrespect from the Canadian fans. So I think we'll have to see how it plays out with the press conference, honestly, before I can make a really valid prediction. But I think that they'll probably be kind to both fighters, if I had to guess.
So at times in the past, when you and I have spoken privately, you have pined to be on the road more. And I'm not necessarily trying to put you on the spot nor pull back the curtain, but in terms of this new gig with Sportsnet, can you tell us anything as to what it means for your coverage of the UFC in 2024 and maybe beyond this first year back with the company?
Yeah, I'm hoping to be at all of the major North American pay-per-views like I have been historically. And I'm also continuing my role as a commentator for Unified MMA, and they've got a card the night before UFC 297 with Dana White looking for a fight. Dana's going to be in attendance, scouting some talent, so that's going to be a lot of fun as well. So I'm doing double duty this week with that, but I'm not really sure, to be honest. Like, our mindset right now, it's almost like the same as the fighters' mindset. Like, there's no tomorrow after January 20th. For us, the day after January 20th is when we can kind of recalibrate. I'm still so new to Sportsnet, and we have this big pay-per-view in Toronto where our studios are in front of us, and we've really been putting all of our eggs in that basket for now, and then we're going to be able to make adjustments, see what worked, see what didn't from there, and then decide what direction we want to go in. So I can't really give you a great answer right now because I don't have it personally.
All right, well, hopefully UFC 297 is an absolute monster and it leads to more of your coverage. I'm curious what it's like for you leaving the children, though, because I'm away 100 nights a year, and leaving my kids and leaving my family at 35 years old, I'm fucking racing out the door. Now at 45, I'm crying, whether crying with my dog. So I'm curious how it is for you, or do you think it sort of helps your work-life balance to get away and then come home and, be excited to be back home?
See, for me, it was kind of the opposite because, early on when I was in my mid-30s, we had young kids at home. So it was so painful for me to leave because my wife was just drowning. Like, we had two kids that were like under 3 years old that she had to deal with when I was on the road. So it made it a lot more challenging for me to travel for that reason. So now with all of the kids in school, at least, when I do leave, my wife's able to take like 6 hours at home without having kids running around and going crazy. So she's able to get that sort of reprieve that she didn't get before. Honestly, the pandemic was something of a saving grace for us because about 2 years without traveling, when I'm at home and we have two young kids, it actually really helped us out a lot because I was able to really, stay at home and focus on them during those really difficult years. Anybody who has young kids, especially two young kids at the same time, how difficult that is. So it's kind of the opposite for me. Like, I'm excited to get on the plane now because I'm not as worried about, my wife having to really, pick up that much slack. She still has to do a lot. Don't get me wrong when I'm gone.
Yeah.
I still appreciate the heck out of her for it. Like, I couldn't do this without her. She's like a godsend for me because she's able to make sure that the kids are, have everything that they need. But now that they're able to go to school, she at least gets a little bit of me time, which she, desperately needed when I was on the road back when I was in my mid-30s.
That's very nice of you to say. Hopefully she listens to the Anik and Florian podcast.
She doesn't. She doesn't. I know that she doesn't watch the sport. She doesn't listen to any MMA podcast. So, she might hear me from upstairs. That's about as close as we'll get.
All right, before I let you go, and I can't wait to see in Toronto, in terms of the Canadian talent, either on this card or beyond, most people ubiquitously believe right now that Mike Malott is Canada's best hope for UFC gold and glory. Brad Katona is going to be a tough out at 135 pounds, one of the best cardiovascular bases and motors in all of MMA. Charles Jourdain, Marc-Andre Barriault. I'm glad you mentioned Lupi Godinez because I think a lot of us forget about the Canadian Association. Jasmine Jasdavicius is coming off a loss to Tracy Cortez. But of all the Canadian names, other than Mike Malott, if you had to plant your flag on one of those athletes to either get to the rankings or make a concerted run, is it one of the names I mentioned or someone else?
Yeah, I think it's Lupi. I think that with the improvements that we've seen from her and her training with Alexa Grasso every single day, not to mention, you're also going to look at the division and the depth of each division and where she can move up the fastest. And I think that would be a strawweight. I think that you look at the other divisions, 145, Charles Jourdain is still in his 20s. He's a beast. But you look up that division and it's just a division. It's murderer's row. It's really difficult for me to predict that he's going to be a champion. Brad Katona, 135 pounds. Again, very hard for me to predict that he's going to be a champion when you look at all of the guys, including Murad Dvalishvili, who has a win over him. I think that there's just you have to look at the divisions where they can move up the fastest. And I think that Lupi at 115 pounds with her wrestling pedigree, with her pace, I think that she is somebody that if I had to pick one, I think she's somebody that we could really get behind. I mean, Mexico can get behind her as well. I know that we're seeing a lot of very successful Mexicans, and to have a Mexican and Canadian champion simultaneously in her, I think that would be really cool for both of those countries. A real NAFTA type association.
Right.
For us. But I think that she probably is the one that would be the most likely to have an opportunity.
Yeah, it's a great fucking answer from one of the best MMA journalists in the business, Aaron Bronsteter on X, at Aaron Bronsteter on Instagram, at A Bronsteter. Yeah, I might be higher on Katona than most, but he's still got to get through Garrett Armfield this weekend. And divisionally, it's hard to expedite a run at 135 pounds. Aaron Bronsteter, great to have you back on the airwaves, buddy. We will see you in about 48 hours or so in Toronto, my man.
Not as great as it is for me to be back with you guys. I'm really thrilled, and I'm looking forward to seeing you later this week. Jon and Kenny, all the best, man. Nice to see you as well. And, good on you for staying sober during those watch parties. I mean, if anybody's going to get canceled, it's going to be Jon and Jason now. So you're playing it safe, and I can appreciate that.
Hey, thank you, buddy. We'll see you soon.
All right, take care, guys. See ya.
There
he is, the great Aaron Bronsteter with us here on the Anik and Florian podcast. Yeah, I do think I might get canceled at some point, Kenny. And that I'm not fearful of that reality. I'll figure out a way to support my family, but I do think at some point it stands to reason, Jay, that I potentially could get canceled. I've been trying to protect you from doing that for 20 years.
I got your back, bro.